Yeah, if you wanna embarrass yourself,
Well, that's gonna happen.
oh, I everyone has to do something in life that they regret.
Oh my gosh.
And one of the perks of being friends with me,
There's many perks, but tell me.
well, one of those perks is that I have been present for a lot of my friends' mistakes.
You may be one of the variables that leads to those mistakes.
That is, I mean, look, there's a lot of ways you could look at it. That's one. The other is I just I just carpe diem like a champ.
You do. I think that's a fair thing for you to say. Yeah, so yeah, I'm just getting your message now. Can jump on early so we can game plan. Well, so
Well,
much for
you
that.
you when I sent you all those questions and you were like, "We'll just take turns." I'm like, "All right, I don't care. I can answer things without much effort whatsoever." Like
Yeah.
like you have PowerPoints. You may have a PowerPoint in this
Yes, I made a PowerPoint slide for each question. No, I'm going the
thing.
opposite direction with this one, man. Trying to find your other questions.
Well, I just sent you two more like a
Yeah, I
couple
got
hours ago,
those.
but there's a
Yeah,
whole list of like
right.
15 or so. Some of them were similar to others, so I just like
Yeah.
collapsed them.
For some reason, I'm not finding it though. I wonder if I deleted it accidentally because you sent it to me as an email, right?
Yeah, I can resend it to you.
Let me see.
Before I
I'm sure I can pull it up. Yeah, here I got it. I got it. I got it. Oh, it was behind that. Yeah, I got it. All good.
my one of my problems is that I don't really email you from the same email all the time,
Yeah.
and I just have so I'm confused. And then I'd say like, wait, I thought I emailed him about this, and then it's not there. But
I know. All right. Well, now that I know that this is a panel thing, we're not using movie magic, but this is
yeah,
just fully live. We'll see
oh
how
yeah,
we'll see how much of a train wreck this is.
no, no. See, you clearly have not taken Charles Taylor serious enough. This is an opportunity for real authenticity.
I don't think Taylor means being unprepared is the most authentic you
Like,
can be.
no, I meant that you aren't hedging your answers. That
That's true.
look, okay, let's just be honest. You posited being unprepared for answering questions about Taylor and Rosa. Like, how many people on the planet have written 3 books about them?
Yeah, I'm probably the only one, but doesn't mean the books are good.
Well, the only way people can find that out is after they buy them. All
That's
right,
right.
so I'm going to hit record now. So
Okay.
now this part will be on the internet like permanently, not just in the group.
Okay.
All right. Boom. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Andy Root. And we've just been having ourselves a good old time exploring religion in the spiritual crisis, ministry in a secular age. You like that energy, Andy?
It's amazing energy. It's amazing energy, and
You want to know why?
because you're prepared and I'm not.
Well, that might be part of it, but also it's 10 o'clock here on Friday in
Oh,
Scotland. And
oh
I
yeah.
I I had some very nice craft beverages delivered that I saved. I didn't even pregame. I saved it just until we started. Everyone's asleep in my house. I got some high quality European lager right here.
Ooh, that looks good.
And we got high quality questions from people that have been reading Charles Taylor and
Are
Heart
you
Mountain
going?
Rosa with us.
Are you going out into the club after our conversation tonight?
No, we're still in lockdown. Like, what do
Um,
you mean club? This is
well,
my club. It's called the Basement. I've got like 16 months of this piece.
well, was it in London? Aren't they like going to the club and burning their masks and
Yeah,
everything?
because
Yeah.
because London is or where like the Republicans of the UK are. They just get rid of all the rules really quickly.
Yeah.
The Scotland started going back down. England, their
Oh.
case their case counts going up, but
But you guys are going
um
down.
yeah,
Oh,
like
that's good.
our peak was of the new variant was
Yeah.
like July 6th, and so
Oh
it's been
wow.
going down since then. So
Well, that's part of the science is they think that the delta goes up high and then comes down. So maybe Scotland's starting to prove that. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
So is this
But
podcast now about our theories of the coronavirus and
no,
politics around that?
no,
Okay.
no. So we've been spending the last 6 weeks reading Heart Montrose, Charles Taylor, talking about religion and the spiritual crisis, and a whole bunch of the people who are in this class have sent in questions that we didn't get to, or a couple of them that they didn't like our answers. And also, there is also, did you notice that we had a request and a tweet about wanting to discuss more Counting Crows? And I just want you all to know we're going to save that to the end. I know some people, they're here for the Counting Crows commentary, and others are like, you did it twice already. And so that'd be our last question. You'll know it's ending when Counting Crows comes back up. But I don't even
amazing
know.
how many podcasts and stuff Adam's been on lately.
I know. It's like
the
guy got psychologically healthy. It took him 10 years to start writing songs again. And then they have the #1 album on Billboard right now.
Seriously?
Wow, yeah, first time in yeah. So I feel like, you know what that says to me, Andy?
That we did it. That they got the Trip Fuller bump.
Yeah. It's either that or we potentially have another #1 in us. Right. Like if, he's older than us, we listened to him when we were like coming of age and we're like, I love fucking Counting Crows. Now he's like #1 again. That says that
we can be #1 again.
Yeah, I have to be we were never at
some point.
We were never technically you were #1 at Youth Ministry Books, right?
That's probably for a few weeks.
So some people are like, what did you do? I wrote August and Everything After and sold 20 million albums. Andy's like,
I wrote
about Relational Youth Ministry
and I sold 10,000 copies.
Which, let's be honest, 10,000 copies
over like a decade.
But each person that bought it has about, let's on average say 30 youth each year.
There you go.
And then they have a youth ministry career, 4 or 5 years. You add it all up, that is 1/4 of the people that bought August and Everything After. Except those people were in youth groups to emphasize the relational encounter of the gospel in the ambiguities, honesty, and authenticity of experience. And they probably have been formed more deeply. You could say that is a hermeneutic for relations that radiates around here. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you. We're gonna take turns picking questions people send in.
All right.
And we'll talk about them. Also, all of you that are watching on different live streams, Andy can't see your commentary, but I can. So feel free to,
talk behind my back if you need to.
Well, no, not talk behind your back. I mean, if they have another question or want to follow up, or
I can talk behind my back too.
And and if you can guess whatever movie or music cultural reference that Andy brings up in questions that he doesn't have slides for, then you too can win a pin. I want you to know you release a podcast episode about and mention that you're going to talk about the Brad movie.
Oh yeah.
And then the week before, so I have to mail some pins out for that. Thanks.
I guess that was I should have said spoiler alert. I should have made you aware of it.
All right. Question number 1. This is from Steve.
Okay.
Steve says, what did, because you have an asynchronous option, you hope attendees of your lectures and readings would get out of this study? See, this Steve is asking a good question. It gives you a chance to tell everyone who maybe hasn't participated fully all the little nuggets, little tasters for them to go back. So,
well, I mean, I think it's a good question because, one of the takeaways is we just invited people, guilt people who didn't read really difficult, convoluted stuff, like that. You could wonder that. I think ultimately, I don't know, Trip, like the thing that I'll take away from the course is just the way we kind of work the secular 0 to 3 and kind of tried to frame that for pastors and ministers to think about, and I think particularly a contribution of our conversation that will continue with me is thinking about how we kind of synthesize those in that one word, that a secular zero really is about access, and then it becomes about participation, or no, it becomes about what was the second one? Secular 2 is participation. Demonstration
Yeah.
was secular 1, and then there's this kind of sense of encounter, again, as an event that becomes important. So, I mean, I think what we hope, especially the first half of the course, but I think the second half too, is just to help people really kind of think about that. I mean, I think you have so many temptations in ministry about what's the kind of core problematic or what's the crisis. And if we don't think enough about it, we kind of get co-opted into thinking the crisis of the ministry, or the crisis that the Protestant church is in right now, or the crisis of religion is really a crisis of relevance. And I think we're trying to say, well, Taylor and Rosa help us. Taylor helps us see it's not a crisis of relevance, and Rosa helps us see that if you try to chase relevance, you're gonna something terrible is going to happen to your soul, if you chase it. That it comes with acceleration, and you lose a kind of faithful way of acting. So I think that's ultimately, for me, that's why I keep reading Taylor and Rosa, is I think they help us think about those things.
Mm-hmm.
How about you?
Okay, let's see. Week 1, you discussed at the kickoff secular 0, secular 1, and there that and Taylor's coming with different types of secular to denote how the cultural context has shifted, right? In our predicament as people of faith today is that we are using a set of assessment, like thinking of what vibrant faith looks like is based on a secular 2 context, which is no longer operative. One in secular 2, you have the religious and the a-religious people, and then the question is, do you participate? Secular 3, the big shift is that the all of a sudden everyone's belief is fragilized, right? Like some people believe in God, some people don't, but most people kind of understand both. Like everyone's kind of a mixture of a believer and a skeptic.
Right.
And in a space of fragilization, the challenge isn't do you join the right Protestant denomination, right? Or do you participate, or are you the right kind of rational atheist or something? The question is how you engage the world. Do you engage it? And he uses take or spin, right? Like, is it open or is it closed? So there, the MO of the minister is not so much, can I get you to participate? Do I have the right program? All that kind of stuff. But can I invite you to engage yourself, your neighbor, your enemy, creation, and God with an open spin? And in that case, we are seekers versus dwellers was one of the lines you gave. And I feel like, we obviously spent a lot more time digging into all of it, but it does, to me, change how you think about being a minister, how you think about being a parent, and honestly, like how you think of your own struggle of faith. A number of the questions we have, this is show back up, but in some sense, in a secular 3, just honesty about secular 3 is problematic to the terms of belief of secular 2 because of fragilization. And if fragilization, where beliefs we aren't really sure, we can't really finalize, we can't have closure, like certainty, absoluteness, seizing it is a problem, then Rosa goes, and guess what happens once you like kind of rip off the one big story everything's wrapped in of Christendom? All these other stories get active. They're competing against each other. And then things start to accelerate. Then technology, blah, 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 blah. And then you don't even know you're wrapped up in something that is ultimately postponing fulfillment and making you anxious. And then what do you do now that you're alienated from everything? Then the question of resonance comes up. So that would be, to me, like the kind of questions I hope people spent time with, but they got cool reading, and you gave cool pop culture references too. So
and misspelled slides and things like that. But
You
You
really
know,
dwell on bad spelling. If you were me, I'm so
I
dyslexic that I,
I'm
when people
dyslexic
point it
too.
out,
No
then
wonder
then
we
here's
like
the
each
key.
other.
Okay, you tell me,
Yeah,
Trip, you misspelled Rosa. You like or Hartmont. You just
yeah,
switch the O and the U. Say that. Well,
yeah.
I'll show you how to do it. You tell me, point it out, and now say, Trip, you misspelled it.
Okay, you want me to just we're
Yeah,
role playing? Is
we're
that what you're
role
saying?
playing. Yeah.
Okay, Trip. I'd like to make you aware that you've misspelled Hartmont.
Oh, Andy, I'm so sorry. I've struggled with my learning disability since I was young, and once I learned I had dyslexia and ADHD, and my teacher thought I would never even graduate college. I just have worked so hard, and sometimes this comes out despite all I do. I'm just so sorry. Like, well, I do
Yeah.
that.
Now it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there you go.
It
You're
doesn't
welcome.
matter that you misspelled it. Yeah.
You're
There you
welcome.
go.
I love it when people like send me that, or
Yeah.
you're like, you didn't put a space between words, and I'm like, you know what? I don't have spaces between words. My hermeneutical frame just really.
They're all pushed together.
All right,
Hey,
now
so
you're gonna get to pick a next
yeah,
question.
well, actually, I think this is we have two files here, but there one that I think builds off this too.
Okay.
Trip is, and it was I think it's right after this one about the ex evangelicals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and kind of thinking about evangelicalism, and I
Oh,
and
it's Eric's question. Gotta give
Eric's
Eric a
question.
shout out.
Give Eric a shout out. Do you have that in front of you? Because I don't have that
Oh
file in
yeah.
front of me. So
He says, where does the evangelical movement fit in here? And how would Taylor Rosa respond to them? A similar question could be posed to those in the process of deconstruction or those who were once part of the church and are now atheists or agnostic. And then he goes on to ask about evangelism or engaging people in that context. So,
yeah,
what do you, there's a whole new generation obsessed with deconstruction,
yeah.
evangelical and stuff. So, how do you think Rosa and Taylor would frame that kind of?
Well, it's interesting to put it in the framework of the secular two, secular three, and I think
Mhm.
again, this is like one of the takeaways that we want to get people. I guess I'll just put it this way. I'll just own this for me. Like the secular two, secular three dynamic feels like the big challenge for Protestant pastors and ministers, that you so quickly get co-opted into secular two issues when the issue is really secular three. And when you do that, you kind of get you kind of get cordoned off in that, or you start not to be able to even see. I guess you get screened off from secular three issues. So when I think about the ex-evangelical thing, and these are just hunches, would have to think about this more, but I do think the secular three reality in calling churches, big, particularly kind of megachurch evangelical churches, to be able to contend with fragilization and the big questions, and to be there in the midst of searching. It's usually in the process of searching. It's usually, not all the time, but young adults or people who've gone through a major transition in their life that start to look at the community of faith that they've been part of, the way they were raised, and start to feel like, my gosh, it's one of the reasons why it's such a huge publishing element, because those kind of people are really motivated readers and go look for help. I'm trying to kind of make sense of now being inside a kind of secular three, or finding their faith fragilized now. And I think they're unique kinds of people who don't necessarily turn completely away from faith, but have found at least the evangelical shell to their faith become fragilized and don't know where to go. But here's the interesting thing that I think that problematizes this a little bit, is that a lot of those people, now I'm overstating this and just we can think about this, but a lot of those people have come from, big mega churches where the kind of objective and almost a consumer framework, which goes down to your kind of consumer felt needs, was to meet everything that you felt, to give you some kind of access and some kind of location of participation in it. And I think there can be a progression in that, where people go from kind of a big evangelical church, they become ex-evangelicals and they hang out in the main line, and then they get really frustrated with a smaller Episcopal church or mainline church, and then they just leave altogether. And it usually isn't a theological or intellectual reality. It maybe starts that way and fragilizes it, but it also becomes just an issue of not feeling like there becomes a lot of blame of the church. Like the church couldn't really deal with my issues. And part of that also is they were raised in a way that the church should directly give access and engage those things that you have. So there's a way that I think the ex-evangelicals are interestingly caught between secular 3 and secular 2, that in some ways their own personal voyage and journey is one of journey and searching and of embracing fragilization. But when they relate to the church, they tend to relate to the church not as its own fragile, backward, not really culturally with it institution. They want it to be very much like a secular 2 church that is going to provide the resources I need with what I'm dealing with. And particularly when they get outside those mega churches, a lot of churches just can't. And so they can become very disgruntled with the church. And you kind of stumble into that Bonhoeffer thing where there is a temptation to try to idealize the church and think, well, the church should be able to deal with the process I'm going through. It should have a resource for me, or it should have some kind of way of being as relevant as the journey I'm on. Not the fact that it might not. So I wonder about that, about how we actually find the ways that we were raised in really successful secular 2 contexts, then frames when we kind of intellectually outgrow those, or our life experience outgrows those, and how we still look back at the church and kind of demand that it function in that secular 2 kind of way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's helpful. And okay, so there are 2 threads I think I distinguish. Like, one is there's the no longer or ceasing to see Enlightenment rationality is necessarily antithetical to the deepest Christian convictions. And so much of American evangelicalism, especially, was formed as a kind of anti-intellectualism, be it the fundamentals early on, be it or the way they come up with different ways of preserving some authoritative closed teaching, be it biblical,
sure,
like inerrancy or the creeds or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so that leads to a kind of engagement in the public square that takes an apologetic form different than classical apologetics. It's a aggressive one where you demand from the opponent a verdict about the rationality of something, and underneath it is a set of assumptions, like a literal historical Adam. Okay, a literal historical Adam. Evangelicals that don't even believe in it get uncomfortable admitting it in public. Mainline Protestants are like, oh, so some people thought there was a literal Adam? And I don't mean that in a mean way, right? Like, I just mean it in a, you think everything about your sweet love of Jesus is connected to some weird beliefs that then became essential because of the conflict with modernity. And when that happened, historically, for different denominations and different parts or tribes within them, was at different historical moments. So, like, right now, there's a bunch of 25-year-olds that all started listening to the podcast. Some of them are in this group who are asking the same questions all my friends asked in 2002 at an emergent village cohort, right? So there's the rational engagement. But the bigger question, and you remember when I played the Tillich's 3 anxiety game with you and you played correlation with Rosa? When I listened back to that, I mostly thought, man, Andy and I need to write an article about this because I just feel like what we just said was so good. And if you ask about the ex-evangelicals, I think it's the narratives that are trying to encapsulate the human predicament that you have become so hard to correlate your actual experience of anxiety under the terms of secular 3, under the terms of social acceleration leading to alienation, that all of a sudden you're like, if those are the problems, whatever the gospel is has no good news about my world because it's trying to convince me to be concerned about eternal conscious torment, porn, and like witnessing to my Muslim neighbor who's better human than me, and not, right, like insert that long discussion. And so, like, after listening to it, and then when I was reading this question, I think part of it might just be that one form of alienation that evangelicalism is the, what are the big questions you, your neighbor, your enemy, and the globe face? Does the gospel have anything to say? And at some point, when you live in a world that's secular 3, that's accelerating, you are like, oh, junk, we have problems. And then you hear all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And clearly that means this 4-step, spiritual laws. Right. Anyway, like, I feel like that might be a bigger.
No, I think that's right. And I think, I guess, maybe this just proves that I'm, getting old and starting to be old man, get off my lawn. But there also there's the temptation that I think to say, okay, I'm now released to really get into secular 3 issues and to feel those problematics and to go on that journey, but then to turn around and say, well, the church should accommodate every need that I have. And just like the seeker sensitive mega church of evangelicalism did, there should be a niche for that. And my point is, if you're on a secular 3 journey, we also then need a kind of different ecclesiology about what is the church, even in its most practical form in a secular 3 reality. And it can't be that it is, there to assist you and in every way. You know what I mean? Like it can't play that consumer game anymore, and we don't want it to. And so I don't know. I guess my point is I just want us to be careful of not beating up the church or expecting the church to be something it shouldn't. And that does lead us into these kind of secular 2 frames.
Well, yeah. And I would just say, as someone in the previous generation that did the whole deconstructed, get angry, over, critique, leave, write memoirs that sell a lot of books. Those that then got fascinated with a whole host of new communities and institutions are still find out they're full of human beings, right? Like, one of the problems of a vapid Christianity is that it's connected to a utopia without real humans in it. And so you remain perpetually disappointed that the human predicaments involved. And actually, that's like the coolest part of, for me at least, the gospel is it actually makes space for like a fully human to be a part of something beautiful. Like the gospel, at the heart of the gospel, is someone who says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And that makes space for a lot of things that if you go from religious to political to social to cultural to whatever types of communities, looking for the one where you really belong and there's real purity or performance of the right virtues or whatever. All right, well, I'm gonna ask you the next question.
Okay, you asked me.
It's my turn. Amanda says,
we're on the next doc, right? So now I can follow along.
Yeah, all the others are on the first one I sent you. Amanda's question: you mentioned how social acceleration generates a kind of social decay rate where things get dated or go old school much faster. Did one of us say go old school? Because that's
a great phrase.
Yeah, I think you should borrow that next time you do that presentation. But anyway, Amanda says, like jokes from TV shows not fitting from a few years ago. You gave like The Office and Parks and Rec. Or the need to keep up with the most hospitable, and in parentheses, some say woke. I'm guessing we can know who Amanda's friends and family say about her desire. The most woke language for almost everything, like gender or homelessness or etc. It seems to that when one has a negative experience of social decay, one either accommodates fast, like catches up, to doing and saying the right thing, or refuses and gets resentful, or maybe just avoids situations it is demanded and stays silent. How do we negotiate this in congregations? How do we stay connected to people struggling with the feeling here of social decay, feeling left out behind, often while thinking the decay is, at least in part, a means to a good end, like Me Too or LGBTQ inclusion? If you think those are good things for the congregation, yet the experience is that social decay, maybe assuming everyone didn't just listen to you talk about social decay, maybe restate the question, but I think it's a really good one. And there were others ministers asked around this, but this one I thought was so specific about your talk that,
it's a great question, and it's phrased in a great way, like you were mentioning, Trip. said it better than I said it earlier. But so what it is this becomes one of the dynamics of Rose's kind of threefold acceleration, if you will. So when we say the world is speeding up, we almost always just think of it in technological ways, like, oh, look at, I remember in 2002 where I had a flip phone or whatever, like it's easy for us to think about that. And you can just even think of things months ago that seems so old or whatever, so we think about it in that frame. But his point is it also is a speed up in just the pace of our lives. We just feel busier and busier and busier, which seems to be, existential and then have spiritual dynamics to it. But he also wants to say, because the kind of technology that speeds up is always transportation and production. And the third one is communication. So those three dynamics always speed up. I mean, you kind of can file the technologies kind of in one of those three. Maybe you can find some outliers, but mostly are in that. Well, if communication and production and transportation are always speeding up, it's impossible for those not to impact our social norms. And so then we just see, and I guess this is what I'm pointing out more than probably Rosa does, that we've just been in a particular moment where our social norms, particular around what one can talk about, things like that, have just can accelerate it in an incredible rate. And I think a lot of those accelerations have been really good. Like and I think that's how this question ends. Like, these are good things that have happened. But if you're pastoring a congregation, there's a lot of people there's a percentage who think this is terrible. And, we have a whole cultural industry now that, goes after this, called Fox News. I mean, basically is, they now, I think their strategy since the election's been lost has been to point to all the social acceleration and call it terrible and awful. And, it's the end of civilization or something, or it's taking us into a new kind of world you don't want to be in, viewer. So there's percentages of those people that find their way into our churches because they're impacted by Fox News or whatever. But then there's just a lot of people. I mean, I think there's people who are on board and are riding that wave well. And then there's just a lot of people, as the question references, that just feel like, well, I want to be supportive of these things, but I don't feel like I can keep up with how things have changed. I didn't know that there was you couldn't say that word anymore, and I don't mean anything by it. And so then those kind of people, and this becomes a real pastoral task, either have to be, I think regardless, those people have to be encouraged that their curiosity and even their failure isn't some kind of deep violation, and that this is a process of actually learning and becoming aware. Because if you don't do that, then what will happen is either people will just stay silent and just avoid it, especially in the upper Midwest where I live. Like, you will just find people who are like, I don't get it, and I just don't want to talk about it anymore. And they'll just, they'll just go against it, or they'll find themselves quote unquote evangelized by the other side. So, I mean, I think one of the things we have to do that's really hard is you do have to be sensitive that this is really fast for some people. And it is really fast. And usually the policing of the fast transition in those social norms, usually it is a real fast technology like Twitter, and kind of doxing someone online becomes the way you do that. I mean, there's huge conversations we need to have. Like, isn't it right now during the Olympics that basically two people, for things that have happened, one in high school and the other like 8 or 10 years ago, have had to resign from their positions, so what does that mean? Those social norms have changed so fast, which is, I guess, is Aziz's point in that clip I showed, that can you really hold people to the standard of social norms from 10 years ago today? And I think Aziz actually has a lot of wisdom here, that a huge piece of this is actually humility. And so how does a congregation and a pastor support a lot of those changes that are happening, and actually I think encase those in even deeper theological language of being important, but also have that kind of awareness and that movement? First of all, recognize it's a process for people, and then secondly, really really uphold where they're at, and that this is a process of learning, and then humility, the whole thing being wrapped in humility, so I'm not a huge virtue ethics kind of guy, or virtue kind of guy, even though I'm getting more and more that way. But I just think humility is it's a lost virtue or social norm that could be helpful. I don't know if that sounds a little bit too
No, no,
grandiose or simple even.
well, no, I think um when I read the question, I thought of finally when I was working at a church for a while, and we had enough ministers change that then all the three that planned worship all agreed we should use gender inclusive language. And I had someone that was really, really upset about this come to my office. And now this is a UCC church in LA. So gender inclusive language was probably 90% of the time. It was just like when the Bennett, we always sing the same. We always would sing the same doxology, and it would Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. We started changing them. So it wasn't even like we got rid of the one they had sang for a long time. We did variations. And some week after, like Creator, Christ, and Spirit, or something like that, I had a visit from a longtime member whose parents and grandparents helped found the church. He told me all about it. And he says, now, Trip, now we all know God's Spirit and doesn't have a gender. So why are you going to start adding these vague lines? And I've heard you even say, call God mom. Like, what's up? What's up with that, man? Like, we don't need to start bringing gender into God, right? Like, God doesn't have body, God's spirit, God's love. And, I realized that homeboy had just like not noticed the fact that he had essentialized masculine language as generic, right? And I was like, I'm not gonna say his name on a live stream. I was like, yeah, I was like that. Look, this is so important. Like I thought you were going to be the wise, mature person in this congregation. I hope you tell some of your friends, because I've gotten some emails where we use other language that's in the Bible about God, and then they freak out because they don't know God's spirit and doesn't have a body and no gender. So when they hear God's Father or God's Abba or King, they think God's like literally a guy with a penis that makes babies, or a king with a crown and has to marry a girl. Like, they think that stuff. They don't know what you just told me. It's so good. And so what we're trying to do, and is we're trying to use all the images in scripture so no one thinks one of them is final. And like, you got it. And okay, so if you could tell me how I could help capture what you just said, because that's exactly what we're going for. And he's just like is looking at me so confused. And I think like that is one of those moments that I'm like, I realized like I have no idea what to do. I'm just going to lean into this. He gave me a gift where you're as a minister stewarding congregational people in all sorts of different places.
Right.
He's a member of the smallest service that is the oldest and the most conservative. And he never meets the overwhelming majority of the church who are younger and at the other service where there's lots of stuff for their kids, because programs bring the people together. Right, Andy?
Right. Yep.
And so I'm like trying to negotiate it. And I like when I read Amanda's question, I'm like, I completely get that. And I wonder if part of the tension is some things that are in culture are like, when Paul says, I'm all things to all people, that's the appropriate category. Like, I'll use this language, tell the stories occupied in this space, because what I'm there for is not really about this.
Right.
But then there are other categories in culture that Paul's like, no, there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, right? Those categories, if we occupy those distinctions in the church, are utterly problematic to its integrity.
Right.
And one of the things in when the speed of social acceleration is so hard is that we don't even have time to figure out, is this a all things to all people moment or a neither nor moment?
Right.
And then it turns into that person's personality. I have some friends that went everything's all things to all people, and they end up begrudgingly conservative. And 10 years later, I'm like, you're about as backwards as it gets. And then I have some people that are like, everything's neither nor. This is like, if you don't agree with me on this, because this is just basic gospel. And then the next thing I know, they're having fights about the kind of recycled plastic at a church, like where whatever it is. And I just think the speed means we need to have more humility in our hermeneutics and more space. But I don't know. I'm probably I put things in the neither nor category more aggressively.
Yeah.
Then my batting average on that's high.
Well, yeah. I mean, we have other questions to get to, but just to piggyback on that, I mean, if we think Taylor's right that there's something in Secular 3 that's a journey, that there's a voyage that you have to go out and search. I mean, this is the danger of acceleration. And so in these issues, what I worry about is that, there are people who would like to figure this out, would like, as these social norms change, to kind of go on this journey of figuring this out and making sense of it. But for them to ask a question or even to say it wrong, it's like, you're slowing us down, man. Like, this is that we have to, if you're not moving this forward, and then you're part of the problem, and you do see that on Twitter often when there are, as a kind of big cultural moment. It's like, if you want to ask questions about this is not the time to ask questions. And there probably are times where there are things to not ask questions about, but you have to be very careful when you're pastoring a church that way. The point here is,
and the church is in a location different than Twitter, or like, I get emails sometimes from the same podcast where someone has demands on each side from whatever it is I said.
Yeah.
And when I said it, I thought, oh, I'm going to get in trouble for this, probably from multiple directions. And where I'll get emails from people that have known me at some point in life, and we're friends. And they're like, this is the most obviously correct thing, Trip.
Right.
One recently was like, I had a guest on say Latino instead of Latinx, right? And then I had someone email me like, thank you for not shoving like master degree Latinx activists down my throat. And this is a socialist Filipino, like, who works in San Diego with a lot of like Mexican individual, like it's like, he's like, this is a problematic for trying to get them to connect to the left because they think this word doesn't work. Then you get someone who is deep, like, this is the most appropriate way because it's non-gendered and it's really appropriate. And they were like, I know you use Latinx, but you didn't correct them. And I was uncomfortable because you left that space there. And then I know that there's like 100 and some countries that are listening to this. And then in America, you get people from from like conservative to progressive denominations in different parts of the country. And so, like, I mean, granted, like, they aren't tithing, so it's not the same as at a church, but just realizing how, if I was a minister in a lot of those places, I would think strategically about how you lead in ways that you can still be heard and bring people towards. Anyway, like,
but the struggle is real, man. Like, even that, like, the struggle is real on trying to thread that needle between that. So
thank you, Amanda, for a great question.
Great question.
And hopefully we didn't ruin it.
All right. I have the next one, I think, after Amanda's, and it works out really well for me because it's a very short question, and it's from Brandon. And Brandon's question is, what's the future of theological education in this context we find ourselves?
There you go. Now, just to clarify for you in the future, and you can pick any from the list, because I doubt we'll get through all of them. So you can just pick the ones you don't want to answer first on.
Well, that's actually why I picked it, because it was short, and because I'd like to hear you talk about that first.
Here, I think the future of theological education is scary. I think denominations love the security and fallback of a set of hoops to jump through. I think the Association of Theological Schools is kind of a racket, but not because they intend to be, but because they're attached to institutions, denominations, and educational institutions that are in survival mode and not interested in their deepest vocation. And I think seminaries are just hoping to be in the half that don't die in the next 20 years, and going to do whatever they need to do that, even if that means coming up with new degrees so that the bottom half of our economic system can go into debt to get degrees, like get their MDiv, get their DMin at a more prestigious school, and change all the workarounds just to get that money in so they can be in the half that survives. And if you meet a head of a seminary, a worker at ATS, a professor, or whatever, none of them are like desire for the system to be this predatory, but it is ultimately problematic. And on top of that, the research universities do the same with random, like with people that want to get master's and PhD degrees. They give less and less funding with less and less job opportunities. All the people that are tenured stay longer and longer, especially the boomers. So there's less opportunities. You have to take twice as many classes with adjuncts as you did before and pay this very same rate, while the adjunct is probably the working poor. And most of my friends with PhDs are adjuncting 12, 13 classes a semester and making as much as a public school teacher without, $70,000, $80,000 of student loans. So the future of theological education is whatever. Yeah. But I don't know if there's like a obvious solution. I think it's definitely something that's going to crash, but it's not really different in a significant way than a lot of graduate programs that aren't funded by STEM industries that are exploiting the planet and the poor.
Right.
And I am on a JTF, a John Templeton Foundation postdoc. Otherwise, I would probably add some other commentary.
He's a wise man. Yeah, I mean, I find this question baffling. I mean, and what I mean by that is it's a great question. It's an absolutely great question, but what baffles me is how to answer it, and I'm sitting in like the heart of a denominational seminary. And, when I started at this seminary 16 years ago in 2005, it still had this sense of being a really strong, the strong, big seminary of a mainline denomination. And, everything is kind of melted and it's become smaller and smaller, and the economic models seem more difficult. So, I mean, to take another step into this, and not to keep continuing to go back to Taylor and Secular 3, though that's what we said this thing was ultimately about. The question becomes, as these structures become weaker at the denominational level, at the seminary level, could we ever even move into trying to train people to address Secular 3? It feels like the temptation is to say, oh, we need to create a bunch of pastors who can actually fund their churches and do kind of Secular 2 kind of things, get more people to participate. Think of funding models that do that. So there is this issue. I mean, I think it's a huge, issue that someone should be writing and thinking about, or like, what would be the kind of economic models for a congregation, and then therefore for theological education that could say really be a seminary for Secular 3. And I think we all kind of sense that the issue is the fragilization of belief and the need to be able to kind of journey with people. And yet then we think, well, how would you ever pay for that? And so we're going to need pastors who can build big churches. And that just becomes harder and harder, let alone Rosa reminding us that it does something devastating to you. And, we have here in the States, very practical points of that, like we have the Mark Driscoll story, which is being a serial podcasting right now. And we have Bill Hybels. In many ways that podcast at certain points is kind of fronting this megachurch movement and all these pastors who, just burnt out or left just chaos in the wake of their burnout or whatever. And that has something to do with the acceleration that Rosa is pointing to. And, so I just don't know theological education, it feels like the solution is always we need to make pastors better entrepreneurs and more innovative. And at least Hartmont would say, whoa, 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 let's be careful with that. Maybe there's something to that, but let's be careful about
do you
that
think
talk.
I think part of it is, if you there are two parts of theological education, which are also, they're parallel to a lot of people that are deconstructing what they're given, right?
Mhm.
Where you go to seminary or you start asking questions, right? Because you genuinely care and inspired and moved by your faith. Then you find out there's a lot more questions. It goes a lot deeper, and the picture of the gospel is bigger and deeper and more beautiful than you imagine. And but in seminary, by the time you get done revisioning things and go through that really powerful formative process,
Yeah.
you got enough student loans. We all know where you're going next.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like you get done with it and are like, I'm just going to try to live deeply out my vocation. You're going to who can help you pay off your student loans at most places.
Yeah.
And most mainline denominations know that the number of jobs that can do that are significantly lower than the number of people they're giving student loans to get degrees. Yeah. So, like, this isn't different than other industries. It's just the church isn't any better than a lot of others. So, like, in the southern region where I was for a while, over the course of 10 years, the number of full-time youth minister positions, like, when you come out, got cut in half. Part-time grew a little bit. Other churches got rid of them. And there was a 30% decrease in your starting pay. All those people had more student loans when they started their jobs than the people a generation before who had less student loans and had a lot higher, mobility. Right. So, like, if you're looking for theological education and ministers with a bunch of student loans to be the prophetic edge of the church, you're looking in the wrong place. I mean, not that there aren't exceptions. It's just, like, by the time you realize that you took this class and you're like, oh, junk. Parents, churches, and everyone are trying to, like, do secular 2 and secular 3 is more important, and they aren't even asking the right questions or checking the right metrics to see if you're having, like, dynamic encounters and trying to live your life before you die. Then good luck.
Yeah.
And it's sad. Like, I wish there was a solution to this. If someone has one,
it's tough.
They should send it to Andy.
I would. I mean, it is amazing. I mean, the last thing to say on this is just we're moving towards maybe a decade of people being like, theological education needs to change. I mean, there's been voices in the wilderness for a long time, but I think across the board, at least in Protestant schools, for sure in mainline schools, but evangelical ones too, like, we need different ways of doing theological education. Let's do it. And yet there's some here and there, but everyone knows something different has to happen, but no one knows what that is. And so if we did know, that would be pretty awesome, but we don't.
Well, now you're going to answer Barry's question.
Okay.
He said, I saw a blog today written by a Harvard Div grad who doesn't believe in God or the Bible, but, quote, loves the idea of the sacred, end quote, and wants to experience transcendence. She writes about doing chaplaincy, internship, CPE, I think, using Jane Eyre as a sacred text. The discussion of dilemmas and the cross pressures has really helped me put this in a broader context than my post-evangelical Baptist self would have. For her, God and traditional religion are non-starters, but on the other hand, late modernity is flat and empty. Anyway, sharing for what it's worth. But I think that experience, like, of just going, what I've inherited, but then going, well, can I just have something other that is a deep, rich narrative I take serious enough to challenge the vapidness, right, of a kind of reductive materialist flatlander style modernity? Is there so how would you process or think through that phenomenon, especially that it was someone who, did an MDiv and then is like, I don't know about the Bible, but I'll go with Jane Eyre, which seems kind of
Yeah.
about as problematic as scripture when it goes to the patriarchy issue. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just think this is what's really fascinating about reading Taylor,
Mhm.
that there's just no easy way out of this conundrum of late modernity, so a lot of, I mean, especially for him as a kind of strongly committed post-Vatican II Catholic, it's like just returning to old forms of religion and church and practice isn't going to do it. And why people would be disgruntled with some of those, and makes every bit of sense to him. I mean, that makes every bit of sense that you would walk away. But what you can do once you walk away, what's actually there for you, I don't think he thinks can actually touch the depth of the human spirit. Like that the alternatives to thinking of the self, say, if we just went there, as yearning for, as needing some kind of transcendent source, he just I think he thinks this is the ultimate conundrum, is that all of this kind of freedom and all of these at times really healthy and at times really necessary moves away from certain expressions of belief, particularly Christian belief, as that's where his story is mainly located, make all sorts of sense to him. That makes complete sense to him. I mean, he is with the 24-year-old who's doing that as he's like moving towards 91. He's like, he gets
Mhm.
that. But he also just wonders, especially in the dilemma section, like was referenced here, like he just doesn't know if there's enough to live on there. And I just find that as a really interesting opening for the necessity of journeying with people and things like that. I
Do
don't know,
you
what would
think?
you add?
Well, I would just say Jane Eyre, or there's a really cool podcast that treats Harry Potter
Yeah,
books as sacred text.
right.
Like, um, obviously, we've spent some time trying to treat Counting Crows albums that way.
Yeah,
The uh, it, but all of those things are narratives and cultural artifacts that seize you,
yeah,
and then in a community wrestling with it, you try to reconfigure yourself in light of a story, right?
yeah,
And if you think through, Rosa gave the three axes of resonance. There's like the social one, um and there he's talking about connections with other people, the material one with objects or nature and that kind of
yeah,
stuff, and then the existential one,
yeah,
like when you go to literature or big cultural narratives, be it
yeah,
Marvel, you go to Comic-Con or whatever, those are in that existential one. And and here's something, I've been thinking about our like the Jungle Whitehead disagreement, but
uh-huh,
I feel like the existential register there, in some sense, regardless of how you affirm it, what you're saying is that my own experience of self as narrative
mm-hmm,
requires a community of others telling another story for me to live it deeply.
right,
And once you do that, which I think almost everyone agrees with this, but it takes intentionality for you to be honest about it. But once you admit that there is this dialectic of narrative engagement required for a kind of deep
mm-hmm,
living, then so much after that, uh, you can't buy the story that existence, life, meaning is just
right,
insert something that is quantifiable and possessive and settled,
yeah,
right? Like, and then the question is, like, what is the most beautiful story and
yeah,
stories to be entangled with,
mm-hmm,
right? And then how do you handle those stories in like in powerful in ways where you're engaging them deeply? And I think the it does take enough people when you're gathering to take something so seriously that you have to call yourself into question when you're engaging the narrative.
Yeah.
And that, I think people are blessed to do that. There's a certain craft of the way, say, AA groups are put together to do it. In Los Angeles, I when I was doing some research for Philosophy of Religion grant, joined all sorts of new religious movement gatherings, and some of the features that ran across them were reciprocal narrative telling. And so I say that because so much of your work, when it goes to like how you tell do Christianity, is the entangling of the members in the body of Christ story with the actual story of Christ.
Right.
And like, if we're thinking of resonance and those different levels, that's possible there is one thing. And honestly, like, I have friends that will just tell me, Trip, I love Star Trek, but I did not get into Star Wars. And whatever the reasons are their reasons, but like,
I feel like it should go the other way, but
I agree.
Yeah.
Star Wars is significantly superior to Star Trek.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. I'm not going to derail,
right?
Because I'm a mature adult. But I just say that because sometimes, like, when you are in secular 3, and the issue isn't you participate or don't, right?
Yeah.
Then someone that, whatever their experience with a religious tradition or a collection of stories in their community, when that won't resonate for them in the moment, we should honor it, because that's the only way we can relate to them in ways that story is anything other than a threat.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that's going to be the relationship to it forever. It just means, like, like, some people can only have cool conversations with you talking about Star Trek, and that's depressing. Some people, when they do Thor, get really, really mad when Jason Aaron, the greatest comic book writer alive today, had Jane Foster become Thor. They're like, what is this? WTF, I hate this. And then I mostly think they should go to hell, but I don't tell them that. I say you should listen to my podcast with him because he's the greatest comic book writer of all time. And Jane Thor gives us a wonderful example of what does it mean to be God, because when you grab the hammer, that you can only pick it up if you're worthy, then what is the worthy God? Jane has terminal cancer, and yet she picks it up, getting rid of the treatment of chemo in order to be a God that is worthy. It's namely the suffering servant God. Anyway, I just feel like if you don't like that and you like Thor, I'm just like, why did you like this? Just because he beats stuff up? Anyway,
man, I don't even know how to follow that up, other than just to say that, in that dilemma section, what's really driving Taylor there is that he just still thinks there's something utterly beautiful about the mystics, and kind of contemporary mystics who, that the old woman in your church who's been praying her husband through cancer treatments, like, that's just freaking beautiful. And saying the same prayers her mother prayed or something. And he just wants to say there's something to hold on to in the midst of that. And he just has that line in the dilemma section where he's like, yes, Christianity can be all of those flat, stupid things, but then you also have to forget all these mystics, who have been with us for, 1,500 years, and forget all these other incredible stories where people absolutely needed something transcendent and even a community of belief to make it through, whether that community was really concrete or was imagined in some way, that becomes really important. So, yeah.
Now you get to pick the next question.
My turn.
Right. When you say that, one of my favorite things you did during the lectures, as you perused the questions to pick your favorite, was when you gave the Francis test,
right,
where if you hear the story of Saint Francis and you're just like, what a waste, what was this guy thinking, then clothespin. If you hear the story of Saint Francis, and you don't even have to be Christian at all, you can be just an atheist, you're like, actually, that's like a life I care about. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like that. If I was going to create a theological personality test, I would put that on it. That'd be
Yeah.
one of the first questions
Yeah.
that then sends them on a trajectory.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's based in story and narrative, and your reaction to it could be, I don't like that story, but man, there's something that calls out to me into it, and I don't like it because there is something that makes me wonder, like, has everything I've been living for really, you know what I mean? Like, it can that story can play on you in multiple ways, but if you're just like, people are stupid and people who believe stuff are dumb, um, yeah, which does give us a good segue into this question.
That's impressive. Like you're really rocking it today. That's a
Well,
segue
okay.
of
So
champs.
yes, we'll see if this is such a good segue. In my mind, it's a good segue. So this is from Sarah, who asks, Tripp hinted at connections between Rosa and the last class exploring theological critiques of capitalism. So Francis Capitalism. I would love to hear more and see what Andy thinks about being explicit about economic critiques within the church. So we didn't probably talk about this enough. Tripp was just kind of how Rosa feels about capitalism.
Well, one of the things I love about, and see, I didn't even check with you in advance because, you know, you have institutional ties, unlike me, in way like I kind of think so in Rosa when he talks about dynamic stabilization, that incessant growth is necessary, right, to the system, and then what does it do? It reshapes the self.
Mm-hmm.
And so the self always feel this kind of incompleteness that I'm just got to get more. I got to outcompete. I got to get more in order to eventually get to the good life, which always just stays right ahead. Yeah. And in fact, if you dial back, you're already losing. Right. If I was making the connection, the biggest connection to the last class on the macro level, it's that our planet can't sustain that.
Right.
But at the micro level, it's that the mode of acceleration, in the last class, we talked about the way our desires have been hijacked. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like the mirror side of acceleration is the way in which the structures of power, economic structures, social structures, like we're trying to have like prestige among your friends, right? Like outcompete them in possessions or like power in a workplace or whatever, you know, all that kind of stuff. They occupy you, and then those desires get harnessed through the cultural technological mediums, be it like how much we're getting tracked, and all that. Anyway, there a lot of, if people are interested, they can just, you know, go to the christiansocialistagenda.com and get the whole class. But when our desires have been occupied so that we aren't even aware of what's getting itself done in us. You know, I pause there and go, that's literally how Paul talked about sin. But today you can do descriptive analysis, and Jorg Rieger kind of describes how this plays out in advertising and such. But we then have desires that come up within us, but they aren't our own, right? And that feeling that you get when reading Rosa, that you'll never be stable, you'll never be secure, you'll never arrive. And what I'm doing sucks so much, I don't know if I get to live before I die. And yet we must persist. Like, what is the engine that moves it? Mm-hmm. In the previous class, we look at the way growth is connected to the stability of an economic order. And then how does that shape the person? And then what do those persons do in community? Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's like a deep resonance. But if someone spends more time looking at Rosa, these aren't abstract, or Charles Taylor. I mean, it's only in America where you can be a passionate intellectual committed to Jesus and not find capitalism suspect. Right. Like if you go to Canada or anywhere in Europe, like even like people that would be 5-point conservative Calvinists, biblical literalists in America, in Scotland, they're like, yeah, but we do need to really deep welfare state, and we got to make the NHS more robust.
Right.
Right. So it's just, anyway, not that
Yeah.
the situations here is great. It's just there is a particular cultural thing,
Right.
which I think is what the question, Sarah's question's about, is Rosa and company. The last class we all talk about this stuff, but then when you're in a congregation,
right,
and they're victims of the way desire's been occupied, they're victims of a culture of acceleration, and you see these as systemic, you don't have a lot of power to change them on your own.
mm-hmm.
And yet, if you bring those issues up, you
mm-hmm.
just get lots of trouble. Like, what do you do with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like,
it does make sense. It makes a lot of sense. And so, you know, to speak of my own experience reading Rosa around this, I would say, I mean, first of all, like some of the sources Rosa's drawing from, I think he is, like you're saying, Trip, like I mean, my gosh, he's a German. He socialism isn't a bad word, you know, for him, like it is for an American, or it's assumed to be for an American. So
and he's an advocate of a UBI, a universal basic income, but like not a base salary, but like a universal basic income that goes to everyone, that's gauged to GDP, and encourages stabilization. That's it. Like,
right.
He's not an economist, he's a sociologist, but he's talking about the form of life. Right. So, you know, it's like if Bernie Sanders and what was his name? Yang had a baby. That was his suggestion.
Yeah. And he's you know, like a lot of the economists that he's dealing with are people who are trying to like look at you know, trying to escape from growth-based economies, you know, which he just, and I think what's interesting about him and helpful about him is to kind of point away from that, is he wants to do that because of our sense of exactly what you're just saying, Trip, of what that does to the human spirit, what it does to a sense of the good life, that we have to get away from that. I find that really deeply captivating, actually, to think about, okay, we do know, like, the desynchronization that he's showing, like that there's just no way you can continue to grow. You just can't. The planet can't do it, and it's really fascinating, because I think Rosa wouldn't quite say it like this, but I would, which is to say, like, listen, carbon's not. Let me finish this whole comment before people freak out. But like, carbon's not terrible for the environment. You know, the earth and the atmosphere and the soil and things like that. It can deal with carbon. It can. The issue is not at this speed. So the issue of climate change is how fast this is all happening. And so what Rosa wants to point to is these just acceleration machines, whether they're in the economy, whether they're in, you know, consumer production, whether they're in our own kind of sense of the worth of our lives, they cannot continually be escalated. You just cannot. There will come a time where we hit a threshold, and we could be at it right now, when it comes to economic structures, and when it comes to the environment, and when it comes to how democracies function. Like, all these things can't be separated from time, but they all cannot just be indefinitely, eternally sped up. And I think he thinks that we have a whole economic system, particularly neoliberal capitalism, is based on the illusion that you can just continue to speed up without stop. And even if you could do that on a blackboard in an economics class, just the earth itself won't allow it. You know, I mean, that it just can't happen that way. But one of the big things for ministry, first of all, I don't know how you talk about that inside of a congregation. And particularly more interesting, I don't know how so if we think like at a huge geopolitical way, that we need to come up with economic models that are non-growth based. And I think there are people working on those. It is really interesting to me, like, how could we think about funding congregations that weren't growth based, you know, non-growth based budgets? Because we don't have any idea of that. I mean, most bishops that I know are kind of thinking like, okay, that church, that's a growing church, because there is both a past history of about 8 to 10% growth in members and budget, and we can see because of demographics and other things, we can see that kind of road up. And that becomes what a good church is. Well, that's all essentially a mini growth-based economy. And well, I mean, this takes us back to the Mars Hill podcast. That cannot go indefinite. A pastor cannot continue to grow, even if a pastor can do that for 10 years. Eventually, their personality and their humanity will not allow them to just continue to push for 5, 8, 10, 15% growth forever. So that's a huge issue. The other side we have to face, though, and so there's, if you kind of read another German theorist that Rosa likes, he deals with him a little bit. He's about the same age as a guy by the name of Andras Retzvix, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he has two really good books that I've been working a lot with here of late. And one is called The Invention of Creativity. And the second one is called A Society of Singularities. I think those are close enough that you could find them. But he does much more work with kind of direct economics within that. And one of the things he makes an argument for is when you go from a kind of Keynesian economic theory to, you know, in the late, well, with Thatcher and with Reagan, into a neoliberal kind of economic reality, that you also take a shift from a kind of organized capitalism to what he calls a creative capitalism. And one of the reasons we're willing to live in this kind of structures we live in is because we all have been, I don't know, convinced, or maybe there's a little bit of a resonance element here too, but of thinking of creativity as like this great good. Like, it is always a compliment if someone says, hey, you're so creative. You know what I mean? But if you would have said that to somebody in like, even like the 18th century or 17th century, and said, you're the most creative theologian I know. Like now, it would be hard for you not to take that a compliment. But if we're talking like 16th century, and I said you were the most creative theologian I would know, it would basically be, I would be saying you're a shit theologian who doesn't know the tradition and really are outside the bounds of orthodoxy. You know what I mean? Like, creativity is not.
But what if it's all true at the same time?
It could all be true. And you can play
I would like everyone to know, you want to know who the first theologian to win a prize for a book in economics was? And it was a suggestion for a non-growth economy in 1992.
1992?
Yeah, John Cobb. Boom.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about. Wrote the first eco philosophy. Is it too late? You know what process theology has on its side? John Cobb. And his initials are JC.
There you go. And it all circles back to Cobb and process theology. So there you go.
Well, but part of that is actually, I mean, I think it's because a process theology actually thinks that the relationships are like primary, right? Like, if you're looking at the energy and the shape of power within the relationships, that's a different question than like just looking at the outputs. Because when you look at the outputs, then you're stuck looking at what are the variables of the outputs you look for. And one of the predicaments of any system of anything is you don't know where all the consequences come from. So there are variables you don't attend to. And one of the things in growth are our relationship to natural resources, or the non-persons who, you know, aren't counted in the economic process. But
But that is exactly Rose's point, is that when that growth goes, what will happen to the relationships? This is what is interesting about Rosa, which probably the economic part isn't as explicit, but it's there. But what his real concern about is around action, how we understand action. And then the way the way he thinks about action is its dynamics relationally. And when you keep speeding things up and then build a whole society on kind of economic systems that just keep speeding up and need to grow, you will then you'll turn all your relationships into instruments. So now you'll look at every relationship all the way down in thinking of how cost effective is it, how efficient is it, are we getting more out of it than we put into it? That will happen to all the relationships, and then you're in a dead world, and that's what he's afraid of.
So when I was doing my PhD, we had to do interdisciplinary classes. So we had to take 2 PhD seminars in other disciplines. And I took both of mine at the it with other PhDs in economics at Claremont. And they're famous for a very conservative economics PhD program.
Mm.
The Claremont Institute and all that kind of stuff. But you only have to pass them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I signed up for it. But so the same semester year I'm doing those was the first semester I took a seminar with a very conservative Catholic, but who's also a Marxist and read Marx, and then took a eco philosophy class, and it was mostly a philosopher and a scientist like going through this data and then thinking about what it means to be human. And after that, about half of the problems or crises in my congregation that were connected to individual families, when you're thinking in these bigger systems and then seeing the logic that drove them, because these were a 1%er congregation, executives at big companies connected to the military industrial complex and the finance in LA. But Sarah's question is so good because I always struggle with how to introduce the big picture.
Yeah.
But after seeing it and then spending time with the advocates, right, of the economic order and wrestling with the analysis stuff and looking at the science and things, like I couldn't undo thinking there were systemic issues at play.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say, like, I've no real good advice on how you negotiate when you talk about that from the pulpit, when you talk about it in education, when you talk about that one-on-one, because no one experiences it's just a systemic situation as if it's not personal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like that's the other side of it is it you could be afflicted by something, but if you don't know it's changed and you call it jewelry, you get mad once it's pointed out.
Yeah.
I just feel it's hard.
Yeah.
One small perk is the current Pope Francis is real direct when it goes to environmental and economic issues.
Yeah.
And so there's someone who has authority that most Protestants don't have.
Right.
Setting the stage.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a long conversation, and maybe we can have another, conversation about this down the road. But it is interesting to me how it's inside this kind of phenomenon that inside this creative, this creative capitalism, that work gets really reimagined. And that, there's all these French economists who are looking at this, like the spirit of the new capitalism and things like that, and just kind of point out how work, like you no longer have a manager, but you have a coach, and a coach is what work becomes is you get paid less, and there's less protections, say, than in the 1960s or something when you worked at a corporation. But you get, like, what you get instead is you get to work on yourself, and so you get to be on a team that works on yourself. And so there's this trade-off that then lifts up kind of creativity and being your own little personal company as being really important. And this is kind of Retzvik's point about how singularity happens. Like in this kind of creative economy, what's the most important is to be singular. And that just has huge effect. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, like, man, the way we start to think about ministry, again, if we get locked into that secular to reality, then, and this is the theological education question too, then we start to want to form pastors who can just compete so they can grow congregations. And the way they're going to do that is be really creative. And the way they're going to be really creative is to remind people of how creative they are and how important they are, which leads them to be slightly narcissistic, if not severely narcissistic, and burnt out at the same time, which is a very bad combination for your pastor to be both burnt out and narcissistic. And yeah, I mean, these things all play into themselves. And so it is a question of formation, because a lot of our lenses on what it would mean to be successful, both as singular individuals as well as, institutional structures we oversee have a certain kind of economic, a certain kind of
Mhm.
capitalist perspective that it may do something to us that we want to be really careful of. And so, I mean, I particularly think that around the self, that there's a certain way that this kind of creative capitalism turns us in on ourselves even more. And so your church may want to have a kind of form of faith formation where it's like really coming out of yourself and encountering a transcendent God, or encountering your neighbor. But if you're not careful, you actually perpetuate this kind of turn on the self. I don't know. Which is again why Taylor likes Francis so much, because what Francis does is step outside that system in many ways and seek for God in it. And if that freaks you out, that's good. But how does it freak you out, or how does that taste in your mouth is a kind of sign of for at least Taylor where you're at.
Yeah. Well, if people want more about that topic, feel free to go just join the capital change group, download the archive and join through and send questions, because there'll be people back on the podcast that deal with that. And the Kevin went above and beyond the Call of Duty in the group. He posted himself asking the questions in video, which I tested trying to play them so we'd see them, and it just didn't work. So I'm going to read them.
Okay.
But the big question is, what is faith? But I'll read his, ideas related to it.
Okay.
All right. What is the relationship between an open take and a strong evaluation in faith? I lean evangelical and Pentecostal. How should we define faith in a way that takes Taylor into account and yet respects the experiences of evangelicals and Pentecostals? Is having an encounter with God through a born-again experience, or hearing God speak in scripture, or hearing a prophetic word spoken by another believer, an example of resonance? The unavailability of resonance would correspond to the fact that you can't force the things to happen. And then when you fake them to get emotional intensity without transformation. I notice we keep speaking of resonance, encounters with the transcendent, etc., without saying anything about God actually being the one behind the encounter. Part of an open take on these things, it seems to me, is to say and think that God spoke to me, God changed me, or God revealed God's self to me. Does that run counter to what Taylor's saying, or is that just uncouth for academic theologians to talk that way? And the amount of uncouthness for theologians is significant. So I don't think Kevin will be the first person to have that feeling. But
he's partly right. Like for Taylor's accused often, I mean, in the philosophy world, of being far too much someone who believes and is okay saying he believes, and he seems so good. But can we
Taylor
trust
comes
someone
across as a fundamentalist to the average philosopher that's not like religious. They're just like, Taylor, I mean, isn't he friends with Jerry Falwell? And you're just like, yeah, there's a long distance between those two. Right. What they just say is they're uncomfortable with anyone comfortably religious.
Right. That's right. And he is comfortably religious while so he's right on that's one of the reasons Taylor doesn't talk that way. It's a really good question, kind of working up from the bottom. Is resonance, I mean, is it like resonance equals speaking God or encountering God? And even more than Taylor, Rosa is not going to come out and show I would say it this way: Rosa is less comfortable with his believing than Taylor is. That does, to be quite honest, I don't know exactly where Rosa is at. I mentioned that, he said that he goes to church once in a while, and a kind of classic Protestant Lutheran denomination, and church by where he lives. But I mean, I don't get the sense like this is a core piece of his life, where I think, it is for Taylor. Now, having said that, I know that Rose has been speaking with some pastors groups and things like that. And I met him at Yale Divinity School when he was over for that. And he's been doing some of that with some groups there. So I'm not going to read into that, but particularly in his books, far less than Taylor is he clear. But I think the intellectual question here is that I don't think you can equate resonance and say revelation. I don't think they're this necessarily the same thing. That you can have an experience of resonance. I mean, this is what Tripp had said earlier about these axes of resonance, that you can have an experience of resonance where you just feel alive, you feel connected to something. I mean, I would imagine, before it went to penalty kicks down at Wembley, people felt really alive at the Euro championship game, and well, actually, Rosa, and we should probably get into this point, would even say that the devastation of it can be an experience of resonance. Resonance doesn't have to be a good feeling. I mean, it can, but it does feel, you feel connected to it. So you could watch England lose in penalty kicks to Italy and just have your heart broken, and yet take the tube back and then take the train back home and feel like, God, that I'm not going to be able to sleep from this loss, but God, I feel connected to these people I went to the match with. And I feel painfully alive from this. And that would be an experience of resonance. So I guess what my point would be, and this is to add on to Rosa, because he just doesn't go there, is you can't say every experience of resonance is God, but I would say experiences of God wear the marks of resonance, that you kind of feel that encounter. Would you add anything to that, Tripp, before we go to what is faith?
I would just say that when it goes to the distinction between resonance and revelation, I would say, like, all three axes, social, material, existential, of resonance that we talked about in week 6, I think they all have possible distinctly religious variations in a sense. And the phenomenological analysis that Rosa gives is about the one experiencing resonance in whatever other they're engaging with.
Right.
When the other, which is always a contingent being, be it the words of scripture, a mountain, a friend, a song, right? Like, you can have resonance with a song that resonates with how much Andy loves his wife, or it's a song about being parents and loving your kids, or nostalgia for your youth and friends, and you can experience resonance.
Or it's Mr. Jones and it reminds you of high school.
Yeah. But don't derail.
Sorry.
But the so then the question is, there's an object and then there's the subject, right? And resonance always pulls in a symbolic third.
Yeah.
Right. And that symbolic third gives this emotive seizing energy to it. An event of revelation, the symbolic third is the big other, or the divine mystery, or whatever way you want to get at it. And so like the phenomenology or the description of the experience of one with resonance is applicable in a multiplicity of situations. But a lot of times the third could be the love between two people.
Sure.
And not God's love for the world. And I wouldn't want to I wouldn't want to bifurcate all those things, but just say, if you're going, resonance is a bigger category than revelation.
Yeah.
But to say that
phenomenologically
it is.
Yeah.
But God is invested not just in right, loving God with all your heart, soul, body, mind, and strength, but also loving your neighbor and your enemy. Right. So when resonance opens up pathways of love, compassion, justice, and grace, then God is present as a third in a different way than anyway.
Yeah, but he's really right that both the unavailability and the absolute necessity of a boundary that holds up otherness, even if it's just a mountain vista or something, that does have a kind of, if you will, kind of catechetical form that can have its impact on you to maybe to give you a disposition to maybe encounter revelation. But revelation would be, I mean, we mean it phenomenologically only, but it would be a kind of subcategory of resonance. It would be inside of resonance, not as, in actuality, it's a much bigger reality than that, but as phenomenologically.
Well, so say a bit just about the faith question.
Yeah, like what is faith?
I mean,
And
I get how all the his questions
yeah,
upon questions are connected to it, but
yeah, I mean, kind of working from his BA back up, when he says I lean evangelical and Pentecostal, I think that there's a certain, we kind of talked about the ex-evangelicals and the cultural evangelicalism, but the kind of broad evangelical experience of hearing the word of God spoken to you, and the Pentecostal experience uh, of the world being open for the Spirit to move in it. I think Taylor's actually very open to those experiences. I mean, they're not his at all. Like he's a classically Catholic, but I think his ideas are very conversant with that kind of disposition. And then where strong evaluation and an open take kind of fit, it's a really good question. I mean, for him, strong evaluation is such an important foundational, if you will, kind of concept for him. And it's fundamentally moral and it's fundamentally narratival. So it's story, and it always is directed towards the good. And an open take, I think, is I don't think he thinks I think he would actually say it depends on your strong evaluation. So even someone who has a closed spin has a strong evaluation. I mean, Trip, you get this all the time from these kind of rigid fundamentalist atheists who have very strong evaluations about religion and things like that, but complete closed takes. So your strong evaluation could become, I think Taylor thinks, let's put it this way, Taylor thinks that your strong evaluation could become a kind of prison that
mhm.
closes the world down. So it is really important for the formation of the human being that they're always finding different communities and different discourses and hearing different narratives to be in conversation with. And if you get caught in an echo chamber, I mean, this is what's so dangerous about our cultural moment. Everyone is caught in their online echo chamber. The vaccine's a lie. The vaccine's a lie. The vaccine is going to murder everyone in a week and a half. And it's
Watch
either
out.
fear or denial. Like, and everyone just gets caught in that
I
echo
was just
chamber.
hoping it was going to work out so you could come to Scotland.
I know
That's what
it didn't work out. We had to change our flight.
I know the pain.
It's, but we're gonna try to come next summer. Are you gonna be around
Oh.
next summer?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
So this got really sad, not for anyone else listening, but just for the two of
But
us.
Kevin, this thing was like I would just say, you pick the next question,
Yeah,
Andy.
but do we need to say what's faith? Like, how would you define faith before we go to the
Oh,
next question?
I would say faith is surrender, openness, existential engagement, trust in the light that breaks through. And that's as in contrast in secular 3 with beliefs, which are assent to ideas,
Mhm.
um, and a kind of finality and certainty. And in a lot of religious contexts, even more progressive ones, the shift of faith as a kind of faith as engaged epistemology is uncomfortable in a world that privileges disengaged epistemology like science or rationality or conservative apologetics or whatever. Um, Faith is a kind of surrendering, opening, giving oneself to that. Like we mentioned earlier about the stories, it's giving yourself to your own story to be tied up into the story of Christ and the body of Christ,
Mm.
and what that looks like in our world. And that's a different thing than assenting to lines of a
Right.
creed or anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that faith is, I would say a couple things just quickly is that are very similar to what Tripp said. I mean, that in one way, faith is trusting in, but in some ways experiencing that um, through Jesus Christ, God takes what's dead and makes it alive, and that even in your own being that you find that. And so the challenge, I think, in thinking about faith, is you were naming it, Trip, and how I kind of want to see it in this kind of movement of God being the actor that takes what's dead and makes it alive, is that I mean, at least for in some readings of Paul, at least there's this kind of ontological move of faith, that
Mhm.
faith is to have your being in Christ, and I think that's a really particularly hard thing inside an immanent frame for people to make sense of. Like I think probably for Paul's audience, I'm sure for sure probably in medieval Christendom, the idea that you could your being could be hidden in another being, like, and it could be taken up, and that your being could be lost in another being, participate in another being. Like, yeah, that makes sense. We see people overtaken by demons, or even this realm is somehow hidden in the being of the king, and his being hidden in the being of God in some way, or something like that. But I think it's really hard for us to kind of think of now this kind of move of being able to echo faith in some way, having this movement of participation, of being in Christ, of no longer living but Christ living in you. I think that's a real challenge, even when it comes to practically, when it comes to faith formation, of how do
Mhm.
those constructs get lived out of a kind of, if you go here, but I think this connects maybe to the Pentecostal element too, of a kind of ontological union between the one who finds faith, is able to, finds faith in the very being of Jesus Christ. I mean, I think I personally still feel like it's quite true, but how
Mhm.
you talk about it is, and how it could make sense to people living in a creative capitalism, in a shrinking middle class, becomes really hard in
Yeah.
suburban churches.
All right. Well, you're going to pick the next question.
I'm going to pick the next
So,
question.
why I say that, I'm just going to say that I promise the last question is going to be my favorite, because
So is this
I
the
don't,
penultimate question?
no. I don't know. Everyone in my family is asleep, Andy. You're the one with children awake.
Right.
I will persevere on behalf of the saints until you're done. But our last question has to be the one related to counting crows,
Okay.
because we promised it. So you decide.
All right. Let's just be the penultimate, and then you ask the ultimate.
Well, okay.
Does that
So
work?
I don't care. I'm I'm having fun. I'm
Okay.
talking to you, and when you go to bed, I'm listening to Lakers podcast while I wash dishes, hearing about possible trade and free agent signings.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I got a lot of dishes to wash. Our dishwasher broke, and
Oh
it's
man,
really stacking up.
that's
I
bad.
know, I know.
That's
I
bad.
have a servant's heart, so I said
Yeah.
I'm gonna catch up on the off season. Look at this vamping. This is high quality vamping. You're staring at those questions,
I am.
trying
I
to
think I
decide.
think I have. Well, do I have it? There was one I saw about the person wondering. There was another question about resonance that I thought was worth.
Oh, Georgia's is good. Is the second one.
Yeah, I think that's the one. Okay,
All right.
Georgia's. So I love the concept of resonance, and all you discussed about Rose's three kinds of resonance as dynamics to cultivate toward an encounter with God, or something like that. How would the con how would the it's a great question. How would or a great statement. How would the concept of resonance help frame a conversation about spiritual formation? Would your different theological commitments have your answers contrast? I mean, maybe we've gotten to that a little bit, I think, Trip. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that? There was
Well,
another one where someone didn't buy resonance that I wanted to get at. So that wasn't the one I was thinking.
all right.
But
Well, you look for that, and I'll just
yeah.
say that I'll turn your screen off while you stare at that, and they'll only
Okay.
see me why I occupy.
Well, I have the dumb look on my
Yeah,
face
well,
because I'm staring.
Georgia. Yeah, but don't talk or it'll flip to you. Until you want to talk. Georgia, I actually think the three axes of resonance are really helpful for thinking about spiritual formation. If you think secular three, where your goal as a minister is to invite people into an open spin, having a strong take about the narrative of Jesus, or the potential for, whatever creative transformation in the life of the body of Christ, or whatever. The three axes of resonance, for me, as a minister, and giving my particular theological commitments as someone very invested in open and relational type theologies, the social axes are connections to other human beings, Um, also, like the communal expression, the political, that resonates to me. Says, like, what are the ways in which our liturgies, our small groups, our interactions, when I'm thinking about spiritual formation, and within the church, can we recognize that in those relations, even though doing the things like making sandwiches for funerals and freezing them, to showing up at a protest together or whatever, what are ways that we can help people recognize that in these acts of embodiment we are resonating with the deep mystery and the mission of the one revealed in Christ? And then on the flip side, right, that's acting from within. What are the ways in which, as members of the body of Christ, when we are engaged in things socially, that when those things, activities, communities resonate with the mission of Christ, do we acknowledge that reciprocal energy? You could say something similar about the material axes, where objects, nature, things like that, or works of art and all that kind of stuff function. So often when you bifurcate the world as religious and non-religious, like in secular too, then you cut yourself off from the invitation to see humanity deep again. And works of art and our place in nature do that, right? And so often as a Christian, you want to go like, oh, well, even the rocks sing praises to the Lord, or the birds, all that kind of stuff. And that's one way, a positive way. But then the negative way is that they're also claiming you. And so, like, what is the way that we take our story of faith, seeing ourselves embedded deeply as part of nature? So long we haven't done that. And that's really connected to the ecological crisis. But axes of resonance, we're thinking about spiritual formation. There's a positive and negative side to each one. And then the existential, where you get, like art, religion, all that kind of stuff. I think here's an example of a kind of intentionality that says, let's train towards resonance. Most people at most congregations don't know why you structure the liturgy the way you structure it. And there's deep symbolic meaning about even the movements of it. And then most people think that Advent is when you decorate a Christmas tree. It's not about a specific time and how you orient yourself. The church is full of ways that invite you to orient your subjectivity and then resonate with a community that says, now we're waiting, and now we're striving, and now we're flourishing. And anyway, there's lots of them. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things about resonance is that those habits of tradition we used to minimize and cast aside to be more culturally relevant are now invitations to be different with distinctions. And those distinctions are, we're resonating on a different timeline. We're resonating with a deeper story. And we're inviting people into a network of relations that are harnessed in the mystery of being. And that mystery we encounter in a homeless first century Jew who was executed by the state and yet said, love your enemy. And so, like, when I think of spiritual formation, those axes are really helpful, but in all ways, there's like a positive and negative side. And there's also a way that they're thematized by the story narrative of what Jesus said, did, and endured. So
that was excellent. That was great. So I found that other question.
Okay, well, considering Andy's penultimate question was not the penultimate question.
There's two penultimate questions.
Okay, well, you just read them both, and then we'll.
Okay, so we did the one. So this would be penultimate question B. That was penultimate question A. So here it is. This is from Jess. She says, I found Rose's analysis of acceleration and temporality provocative and appealing. However, his salvific notion of resonance seems a bit bourgeois to me. Born as the eldest son to a working class family and educated in the middle class, I found different dynamics when I dated and even married into the middle class as well as working class women. After a divorce, I again dated both educated middle class women and working class women, no college degree. And while I was drawn to both, the horizon of each I found to be different. Is the horizon of Rose's resonance distinctively of an educational in suburban and upper class, is the question. Are the working classes still cannon fodder for capitalism? Just a thought.
Well, Jess, I believe, is a male, but you don't know. I think this is Jess Hell, but I only put first names on it, and I believe he's a lawyer, if I remember. Who was because I cut and paste this out of an email. It was apologetic. He was like, I know this class is technically for ministers. I'm just a lawyer that's deeply religious, and I had this idea. Anyway,
That's cool. That's very cool.
I mean,
Thanks for
I
being part of
support
this, Jess.
yeah, but yeah, what do you think? Like, or do you want me to answer first? Like, I feel like you were looking for this question. I vamped with high quality material for penultimate A.
Well, you vamped so well. It was both a sermon and a lecture. It was pretty sweet. So yeah, I can start. I mean, the reason I'm drawn to this question is because I think this is a common concern that people have in a critique, I guess they have of Rosa, which is that this resonance thing seems bourgeois. It seems highly upper middle class. It seems like something that would come out of a university, maybe not an American university, but out of a university. And it seems idealistic, oh, resonance, let's all have resonance. And I think those things really, I think they actually drive Hartmut nuts. I think that he will come to life most kind of trying to defend those points, not because he thinks people are stupid for having those critiques, but because I think he does see this being broader. So one of the things to say is it just a bourgeois phenomenon? At least the acceleration of time, Rosa really believes, is a universal reality. However, the unique encounter of time is different across class structures, but living under the tyranny of time is universal. So for middle class people, and it'd be interesting for him, it'd be very fascinating for him to talk about his dating life as we think about these. That would be a very good podcast or good conversation. But Rosa's point would be, if you are a kind of middle class or upwardly mobile person, the tyranny of time is often internal. Shit, am I doing enough with my time? How am I going to get everything done for my kids? I feel guilty that I'm not using my time very well. So the location of the tyranny is internal. If he wants to say, if you're a working class person, you feel the same tyranny of time, but it isn't often internal, it's external. So you feel like it's the boss, it's the time clock, it's that you don't make enough an hour to actually pay all your bills. So you feel it that way. And then he even goes to those who say are on disability or homeless. And he's like, they live under the tyranny of time as well. And that tyranny of time is that they often are perceived by the rest of us in the kind of class structure as wasting their time. I mean, there's almost a repulsed sense of people who sit on the side of the road and panhandle because, my gosh, why aren't they using their time better? Or where's your value if you're not actually able to do that? So he does want to see that this has there's class distinctions in how this plays out, but that kind of living under this sense of the tyrannical acceleration of time goes across class distinctions. The other element to it, I don't know, you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that I think that there's a part of the way acceleration shows up in class distinction is the way one relates to the responsibility of acceleration.
That's a far better way of saying it. Yep.
Middle class people internalize the quest of acceleration as a demand they put upon themselves. Working class people, it's an external demand. But both of them
or a boss or a company. Yep.
Yeah, but both of them, I would just say, hashtag capital change class previously, are a way you bifurcate the oppressed in order to realize that a way of avoiding recognizing that 99% are all being screwed by the one. But but Jess was in that class. So I also think that there's a communication element that's different. So like in one sense, yes, Rosa knows as like a influential academic who hears him first, right? Like,
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
There is a way to see him pitch this towards a larger audience that I think, is to watch his talk on burnout that he did as a TED talk. That he put some more effort, and it's obviously short, but at connecting to people that might just see a 10-minute video, as opposed to people that are like, man, what I love? 600-page books.
Right. Thick ones, hardcover.
Yeah.
Where the pages are big and the font is small. That's what I love. Yeah.
You were about to, what was the second half?
Oh, it's just the second thing I was going to say is where I've seen him get really worked up, and whether it's been in a lecture or in different kind of places where I've seen him speak, is that that it isn't just idealistic. It isn't this kind of flowery, everything's going perfect kind of thing. There is a certain kind of Lutheran dialectic that's lodged in him where there's a profundity that comes out of suffering. And so he does a lot of work of talking about suffering itself, that residents can suffer. And so like what I don't, like this is an old reference here, but I haven't done enough pop culture references in this conversation. I don't feel like, Trip, but there's if you do a YouTube search of Mike Posner's, I can't remember the title of the song, but the one what starts with "I took a pill in Ibiza," that one. He does this. You know that song?
I don't know. I mean, it might be a fault of your singing quality, but
I'm sure it is actually, and I'm not going to go any further. I could go further, but then I would screw up the lyrics and humiliate myself.
So you don't think it would occasion a moment of resonance for everyone here?
No. But I will tell you that if you watch this, and he did it for some radio station, it became an experience of resonance for me, because he starts and he says he's just got his guitar. It's going to be an acoustic thing, and he's like, "My dad died," and he goes, "My dad died this year," and then he said, "I realized that I'm going to die," and then he said, these two friends he had died as well. And he said, "You know what I realized? I realized that everybody wants you to not acknowledge and that you're going to die. Because if you don't acknowledge that you're going to die, then they can get you to do what they want you to do, to buy what they want you to buy. But if you acknowledge you're going to die, then you're forced to live your life, to actually live." And it's just a beautiful example of what Rosa thinks suffering can do in resonance, that it can pull you into. I mean, it can be absolutely devastating. It can crush your humanity. But it also, this is what he means by like the reference I use, which isn't as dynamic as this one. But like going to a sad movie where you feel that, but you also feel connected to something. And I thought it was really fascinating because Mike Posner, I don't think, is known as like the most intellectual of pop stars that have ever existed or something. But it was a really profound statement that at a certain level, at least in some Christian traditions, is really profound in the sense that how are you preparing for a good death, and knowing that Jesus Christ has died needs you to, not deny your death, but kind of face it. And if you can face your death, you can live. Like if you keep your death in the front of your mind in some ways, you are moved into living. It has this kind of dialectical nature that facing that allows you to live. And we just don't do that. I mean, my daughter's 14 and I read Todd Billings' book about kind of preparing for a death. And, Todd Billings teaches at Western and has been battling cancer for a long time. And so one night at dinner, I asked my kids, like, and he makes this a really strong point that faithful Christian life is about preparing for a Christian death. And I asked my kids, like, so how are you guys preparing for your death? And my 14-year-old daughter is just the sweetest person ever. Was like, "Oh my God, Dad, what are you talking?" Like, close your ears. It's almost as if I said, like, "Guys, I want you to bed early because your mom and I, there's gonna be some noises coming in that room, and I don't want." Like, it was like we talk about sex at the dinner table. She just didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to think about it. And so there's a certain way that we get formed into doing exactly what Mike Posner says.
Look, you mentioned that story. You mentioned that story in the class.
Did I mention that in class?
Yes. Oh, and I then was like, I'm going to bring this up. And my children did not respond better than yours. I was hoping I was going to have a bragging point.
Yeah.
I was hoping I was going to say, look.
Because you told great stories about Elgin, and it seems like he's like the next Eckhart or something,
No, Elgin flips between being 10 and 70. Like that, like yesterday he was like, in the middle of the day, he goes, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And I was like, yeah, I know that. I'm working on, I'm doing the next homebrewed class is with Diana Butler Bass and Brian McLaren. We're talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And I guess he like saw something on the internet. I have
You're
no
like,
idea.
You're 10, 20 anniversary. When it happened,
Well, he's
you were 10
13.
years from
He's
existing.
13.
Oh, he's 13. Sorry.
Yeah, but I was like, Mom and I just got married, like, and I'm no, we were about to get married. Like we weren't even married yet.
Yeah.
And he goes, I would like to watch United 93 with you and be allowed to pause it and ask questions whenever I want. And I was like, all right. Now, personally, I've never actually watched a movie. I have no interest in watching it. He wanted to. And then his questions were like, what were you doing during this moment? And I was like, hey, that story's in a book I wrote. And he's like, no, what were you doing? I was like, well, later in your life, if I'm dead and you feel lonely and read this book, I'm not promising it's the same thing that's in there, and I'll trust the book more. And he's like, so you don't even remember. It was like the event that shaped your entire generation, derailed the post-World War II stabilization, and sent the world into tyrannical battles between religions and culture that capitalism is harnessed to the destruction of the planet. And you just like aren't even sure what you did. I was like, yeah, I trust what I wrote like 5 or 6 years ago when I wrote about it in a book more than what I'm going to tell you, but I'll talk to you. Right. Yeah. It took us 7 hours to watch a 2-hour movie.
Oh my gosh.
And I have
I don't know. I think this is a flex, man. Like you're saying that you're the kind of dad who has 7 hours to talk to their kids.
I charted out like the countries the hijackers came from, all that kind of stuff, and at one point he was like, well, he brought up conspiracies, and I was like, well, there was a conspiracy about 9/11, which as a Claremont person I'm very familiar with because David Ray Griffin was a 9/11 truther. And I explained it to him with gusto, and then we had to like go through that. It was I don't know what the hell I signed up for. I don't know why I'm telling you the story right now, but it was
because I retold a story.
Okay.
From a class.
You retold a story.
That was too.
And then I tried the death thing.
Yeah, you tried the death thing. How'd that go?
It goes like this. Alicia goes, Trip's probably doing this for a podcast in her head, and goes, huh, that's interesting. Haven, 4-year-old.
Yeah.
Have you considered your impending death? And Haven goes, I'm a pirate. And then she goes, Cora, have you considered your finitude? And she goes, well, if I answer this question, could I get a popsicle and then we turn on music and Dad dancing me outside? And she's like, yeah. And then she's like, I don't like finitude, but I don't hate finitude. I don't really know who that is. So I think God loves them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, it's not a name, and Elgin is like sitting there like, and I was like, Elgin, you have thoughts about finitude? And he's like, I mean, personally, I go back and forth about how important it is, but it is an important distinction if you start to think religiously, because God doesn't have a beginning or an ending, so you just can't like say things that have beginnings and endings about God. Dad calls it predication. But that does mean that our beginning and ending, if you still believing God in that moment comes from the infinite God who doesn't have thumbs, love. And now I don't even know if I believe that, but I want to. And the best reason to be Christian is that all our beginnings and endings are tied in a love that doesn't have one. And I was just like, and his face was just like, fuck you, Dad. Oh, sorry, this was on Facebook Live. His face was just like, 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 I can't handle this. And then in my head, I was just like, could you tutor my next master's philosophy of religion class? Because he was just like, screw you. He was just like, I know what Dad's talking about. I don't even want to have to deal with this.
Wow. Yep. That's good. That's good flex, man.
Yeah, but
you talk to your kids for 7 hours and then they use all that technical language.
Yeah, but half of his times he wanted me to pause that movie were him just to be like, how long does this shit have to go on before they realize this is a hijacking and they're going to crash it? He's like, I know that. He's like, it's pretty clear. Like at some point, the longer they discuss this, the bigger the problem. He's like, and what's the worst thing that happens? And he's like, and I'm like, Elgin, can we just watch a movie? And then like when he puts it together, there's like a scene where everyone, and it flashes to multiple people, are praying different prayers, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's like, stop it, Dad. And I can stop it, and he's like, no, I know everyone's going to want to pray in that time, but like, I just find it problematic that why didn't they stick a Muslim on this plane for the movie who's not a terrorist? Because the overwhelming majority of Muslims are not terrorists. Then you could confuse an abhorrent version of the Muslim religion with just Islam in general. And no one except like a few angry atheists does that with Christianity. Like we just like killed all sorts of stuff because we thought God told us to. It was just like not recently, so people don't hate us for it. But like, what do you do with that? And I'm like, dude, I'm not the one that made this movie, and I don't know who was on that plane. Like, and even President Bush, who I kind of think's a war criminal, but like he at least said, like all Muslims aren't. Like, I was like, the response you're having, plenty of Christians had. Like, it's cool, it's cool. Like, he's just like,
Are we ready for the ultimate, the ultimate question?
Yeah, I guess so.
These other 4 people who have stayed on this the whole time, they deserve some reward, I think.
Hold on, I'll pull up. 78. There's still 78 on.
Oh, there's 78 people. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, on all the streams.
On all the streams, yeah.
On all locations.
Yeah.
Which is pretty impressive.
And many of them you taught their kids at dinner time how to say the F word.
I'm really sorry about that. I was not intentional. It was after midnight my time.
Yeah. But I'm guessing 50 of these 70 people are here to hear us talk about the Counting Crows. So
yeah, they knew that was coming. They knew it was coming. So, and I want you to know, there was a Pat's high quality Peter Berger question.
Oh, there was a very high quality.
I know. I actually wrote notes to respond to your question. I'll bring it up in a future Homebrewed episode. Colossus question about the stability of growth. We kind of touched on it.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that could come back up. I'm trying to see if there's something like we didn't talk about completely. Don's question. It's a good one. That will derail if we bring it up. All right. But the conclusion. Gary says, and this is high quality material here, no real question, but I'm here for more Counting Crows talk and other 90s hype. So if you're thinking through Taylor and Rosa
Yeah.
and 90s hype,
Yeah.
what's the other 90s hype? Because Counting Crows now has the #1 album on Billboards, which,
Yeah.
you know, that's like the fountain of youth for us, I guess.
I guess it is.
We're in youth group again.
Yeah. Yeah.
But do you have a 90s hype reference to the class? Because I actually thought about this in advance.
Then you go first.
All right. So now I'm sure homebrewed listeners are not going to be surprised by this, but the correlation of Counting Crows when it goes to music, and if you listen enough to the podcast, and I'm not suggesting you listen to all 1,300 of them, but like Counting Crows shows up regularly. The filmmaker with the 90s vibe. Do you want to guess which filmmaker Tripp has the same love for Counting Crows? Like, there's one filmmaker. Yeah, I guess.
Well, I know you're a Kevin Smith guy.
Hell yeah. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Kevin Smith. And if you were like thinking Charles Taylor and Kevin Smith.
Yeah.
Or Rosa and Kevin Smith, they're great talking points. One, the Clerks movies.
Yeah.
What happens? You see the way the Xer generation like comes into the world, is engaged in the remedial existence at a place, also trying to find forms of resonance in different narratives, be it hockey on the storefront, love stories of resonance, the way it'll treat film as if it's something that can seize you. Why? Because they're the first generation to experience a kind of vapidness of traditional inherited religion. Kevin Smith grew up Catholic and was an altar boy and all that kind of stuff, and was always wrestling with it. Then by the time you get Mallrats, which is beautiful because it's the crescendo and the beginning of the downfall of the mall, and the introduction of nerd culture as a meta narrative, right, to explore. You get you then get Clerks 2, Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, both of which are taking characters who were never allowed to fully mature into the next generation. That is a predicament of Xers and older millennials, is that you never got the infrastructure of maturity, owning a home and careers with retirement and all that kind of stuff, and all these kind of things. You then are having to get older, but you never really mature in having more stability. Mallrats does it for the infrastructure of the world. Clerks 2 does it. I mean, it's set in whatever, like, a drive-through place. Jay and Silent Bob does it in different ways. Then he goes on this trajectory of telling horror stories in Americana. Kevin Smith calls himself a Han Solo Christian, where he's not really down with the Force, but he likes the story behind the Force. So if you need him just to roll back at the right time in the Millennium Falcon and like try to pepper, pepper all those evil Empire ships and Darth Vader off so that you can use the Force and take out the Death Star. He's great. Like, he loves it. He's totally down. He's just like,
and that larger narrative will allow him to do some self-sacrifice. I mean, that narrative will do that, but he's not like, down for the day-to-day thing.
And he said that before Han Solo sacrificed himself to approach his son, seeking a kind of resonance that pulls him out of the giant narratives of galactic oppression.
Wow.
And anyway, I love Kevin Smith. They just announced 2 days ago that they're doing Clerks 3, and my level of excitement was inappropriate. So much that when I told Elgin and Alicia, they were both like, "You look like you're about to cry." And I was like, I'm just so excited. And Elgin's like, "You made me watch one of his movies once." I was like, yeah, but you weren't really old enough. I was sick and was watching movies.
You were 4, and I just felt like you had to watch it.
Yeah.
We had to
So
watch Clerks.
I was just like, I thought you were gonna like a stinky hand. But I'm like, you're old enough now. Like we can rewatch the whole View Askewverse movies before Clerks 3 comes out. And he's like, Dad, I don't know if you want me to do that. And Alicia's comments are like, I've watched all these movies with him.
Yeah.
They are not as funny as he thinks. And because he laughs so much, it's uncomfortable and you feel guilty.
Yeah.
Okay, but but
But I have a question on this because I've been thinking
Right.
about this, and I don't know that this will probably just sound weird, but don't you feel like in some ways the ethos and I don't know, just the reality of the 90s has got washed away. Like what's held on? I'm not talking about individuals like here, Kevin Smith's still doing stuff, Counting Crows is number one, but just like the sensibility, at least to some of the 90s stuff, it doesn't seem to have lasted like this, like the 60s, like a la Taylor, that like we're still 1969, we're still working out
Yeah.
authenticity. But there was a certain way that especially the early 90s stuff was a real pushback against some of that. It was a real pushback against the way celebrity was structured. I mean, I'm thinking like David Foster Wallace's stuff to the way that the Seattle scene. And
do you think, how would you differentiate the early 90s pushback from the mid 60s? Like, obviously at this point it got Forrest Gumped, right? Like where all of a sudden you're allowed to simultaneously what was the drummer for the Eagles? Don Henley.
Yeah, Henley.
He has that album that's basically like the one he won the Grammy for was basically like how the Reagan world was the mirror opposite of everything they ever wanted.
Yeah, right.
And they don't even admit it, right? Like,
right.
And
but that's the world they created coming out of that,
Right.
Yeah.
So they create that world and then they raise us.
And we push back against that.
We pushed back against it, but then we realized they had been faking it the whole time, because what did we do on vacation? We went to freaking Bubba Gump.
Yeah.
What is Bubba Gump restaurants? It's nostalgia for the fact that you could at one point have had an ideal that you then sacrificed for a retirement plan because there's no other option. And I feel like every generation after that, there's just diminishing returns. Like the nostalgia is less and less. But if you look at a lot of the big podcast networks and stuff, they've had whole series in the last 2 years that are nostalgia about grunge, early 90s and stuff. And
maybe that's where I am too.
Even the other day, I went into town, which I mean, in Scotland, we're still like Lock-ish down.
Yeah.
And these two people said, "Oh," I was walking our neighbor's dog, said, "Hey, cute dog." One of them is wearing a Nirvana shirt, easily under 20.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Sweet shirt." And she's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Well, what's your favorite Nirvana tune?"
Yeah.
I just like them. And I was like, "Would you have a favorite album?" Nah, I just like them. And I realized they probably haven't even listened to Nirvana.
Sure.
They just have a Nirvana t-shirt on that means something.
Yeah.
And
those idiot kids could scream it so easily. They don't even have to go find it. They just have to, put it into their music streaming service. Kids.
Yeah, with the last time that what's his name? The drummer for Nirvana, that's Foo Fighters.
Dave Grohl
was on what's the late night guy that just left? Redhead guy.
Oh, Conan.
Yeah. I,
Yeah, I think we are getting to our end for you. My dog wants to eat. She's come in here, and you
well,
can't
you can
remember
see
Conan.
I I went to see Conan once, but 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 the thing that was funny was he like told a story about his daughter, like they're in the car and just like Nevermind comes on,
Yeah,
and she knows all the words and he's never heard her listen to it before,
yeah,
and I realized I think that is like I don't know, beautiful, but like a powerful account of how a lot of people that didn't grow up in a secular too, where you're either in or out of some regime,
mm-hmm.
that you could have something so essential to you. Like, think of
Mm-hmm.
how much Dave Grohl's life is defined by
Yeah,
being in Nirvana,
yeah,
Kurt Cobain's death,
yeah,
writing this album while he's with it, but he will never express it. Then it becomes Foo Fighters, and then he has this
yeah,
band. It becomes like the rock band, blah 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 blah. And then his daughter, because he doesn't even share that with her in any like intentional way, like doesn't even think about it. He's like, I hadn't even thought about it. Like it's sad for me when I hear it. I don't think about it. And all of a sudden, Nevermind comes on and she's singing it. And I just
mm-hmm.
turn it up and sing along. He's like, and I'm crying in the front. She's like, why are you crying? It's a great song. And he's like, yeah,
Yeah,
you know. And I feel like a lot of parents, when I was youth minister, would be like Dave Grohl when their kids got confirmed, and are like telling their story, like, that's what y'all were doing in the church basement or whatever.
yeah,
Because somehow the shift was such that our religious narratives became so important and private that then they weren't even shared among family and friends.
yeah,
And all of a sudden you could get Dave Grohl's daughter knowing all the words. And and yet he never even experienced sharing it with her until it happened to come on the radio.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. We maybe need to have another session on thinking of what's happened to the social imaginary of the 90s, or how embedded is it in our social imaginary now. Because I just think of like things like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but like the way of the kind of pushback towards fame and the way towards celebrity and toward entertainment, that kind of pushback, I don't feel like is in our social imaginary now. Like
Mhm.
I feel like it's a more of a our parents that's gotten there. Even the way we think about maybe gender and sexuality and things like that is not as much 90s driven. The way we think about the heroic, what it means to even be heroic, it doesn't feel like it's as much this certain kind of consumer suburban nihilism that was there in some parts of the 90s. I don't know. I don't have any developed thoughts on it, but like the longing of Adam Duritz in Counting Crows is I don't know. It's harder to find that for sure on like top 40 or whatever.
Yeah, I feel like that a lot more of pop culture, that the potential for rapturous, like extremely ecstatic breakthrough.
Yeah.
They
Durkheim's
never even
collective effervescence. Yes.
yeah, they never even broke up with it, you
Yeah.
know? And one of the things about Adam Duritz is the potential for like touching the infinite or just tasting it. The taste of the infinite was so close that his yearning like was real pain.
Mm-hmm.
And now even the examples she gave in the class,
Mm-hmm.
like it's not till they get, or maybe you'd say like the age in which the haunting of the infinite
Yeah.
shows up is even older or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've had enough conversations with people that give all sorts of different variables, but
Yeah.
I mean, I do think it's different in the sense that um the one of my buddies does, I mean, he's a what's it called, a musical anthropologist, but it's not
Yeah.
musical
I don't
anthropologist, but
know.
that's what I
No
would
idea.
call it.
Yeah.
But
I only know things like that's Conan and that's Dave Grohl. I don't know. I don't know the fancier stuff.
Well, well, yeah. When my mind goes into thinking about theorists, I don't remember pop culture references very well. But he's pointed out a number of times that his whole theory is that there are a whole set of anxieties and questions that cultures are always asking.
Mhm.
But the shift in cultures is always what's the permitted question and what's the permitted acknowledged anxiety. Right.
Mhm.
And so a lot of boomers are like, oh, well, they're so like touchy feely, or they're just so sensitive, or snowflakes, or whatever. But it's also all related to the way they're responding to those issues in their own kids. So they're like, everyone gets a freaking trophy and blah, 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 blah.
Mhm.
And so if you don't know the typography of anxiety, then you don't understand the way in which the big questions show up. And in the 90s were an aberration between the two big generations of the boomers and millennials.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I just we need to be
Even though
done
you
because
don't
my
like
dog wants.
generational things.
Right. I don't get in big into generational things. But I will say that I just feel like the kind of disposition of Fight Club, the kind of world picture of the Fight Club, just it's still there, but it's not a kind of a frontal reality in our social imaginary as much, I think. And part of that makes me nostalgic and sad.
All right. Well, there we answered a bunch of your questions. Andy's nostalgic and sad.
That's the place you should end a 2.5 hour Q&A.
And what's the URL they should go to if they're a minister and want to sign up for your cohort of resonance?
Oh yeah, so we are putting together 2 cohorts of people who can kind of think about how we
ministerial resonators.
Ministerial resonators. That if you want to be one of 24 ministerial resonators, go to the website Relevance to Resonance, and that will bounce you sort of into a Luther Seminary page. But that's it. If you go to like Relevance to Resonance, is that what it is? Relevance to Resonance, I think.
I really hope it's relevant to resonance, as Andy confirms that it is indeed.
It is. It's Relevance to Resonance, and that will take you there, and then you'll see to sign up for these resonance groups. So we hope you sign up. Though we're going to take 24 people and think about what this could look like more directly and practically in your church
and
or ministry.
I personally hope that at least enough people sign up for it that you don't have unused money, because you're basically paying people to hang out with you and to not suck at their job.
Yes, and it would be sad if I couldn't even pay people to hang out with me.
Yeah.
But if it does get competitive, just have references to Fight Club, and that may help you get a spot in this.
So the trick is to fit a Fight Club reference into your application.
Yeah, so that I'm less sad and more nostalgic.
And if it's a reference to the book of something that doesn't happen in the movie, is that like a bonus level?
I feel like that would violate the whole 90s vibe. Like, we didn't read in the 90s, we watched movies.
Yeah, because the authoritative text is the authoritative text is the movie,
which is what Infinite Jest taught us. Hence, Infinite Jest is the movie. So there you go.
Well, I'm glad we figured all that out. I'm gonna go to bed. Andy's gonna do whatever he does in the afternoon. He's gonna. And
my family doesn't care that I've been down here for 2.5 hours, but my dog's like, what the hell? You feed me at like 5:30. It's 6:30. So
all right. Well, smoochy boochies, all you people. And for some of you, you know that is indeed from Jay and Silent Bob of the View Askew universe. And Andy, thank you for saying yes to hang out with me for this class.
This has been super fun. Thanks to everyone out there and for being part of it. And thanks, Trip.
All right. Well,
do we leave now because this is a live thing?
Oh, no, I'm about to hit end after I say some. Well, I already said smoochy boochie, so now I just have to say share the brew. Something like that. Well, you say it. You say smoochy boochies to the peeps.
Smoochy boochies, share the brew, and we'll see you later.